So I remember once I went to a Richard Gage presentation at Seattle Town Hall, and Richard Gage has a very interesting way of presenting to the audience. Pretty much what he does is at the beginning of his presentation, he'll ask for a show of hands, how many people believe in the official story? And he'll count out the number very dramatically.
Kind of a loaded term already.
Right, exactly right. He'll open with a loaded question. How many people believe the official story? Instead of the FEMA report or whatever be the
scientific consensus.
Right. Thank you. So what he does, he'll ask then. A number of people raise their hands. He'll ask again midway. A fewer amount of people raise their hands, and he'll ask again at the end of the show. And by then, there's so much pressure for you. There's so much social pressure for you to not raise your hand that if you do, you are the doofus. Well, guess who raised their hand? I raised my hand, and I was immediately mobbed by people. People pressed DVDs into my hand. They came over. They took pictures of my face. They were intimidating me. They were trying to intimidate me into changing my mind, and I refused to do it. But that gives you a sense of it's not science. It's social pressure. It's asking questions that aren't valid. It's using logical fallacies. It's using videos that play on an emotional tone with a propaganda angle to them. That's pretty much the case of the inside job is.
Yeah, I've seen so many of the similarities between the methodology and the tone that they use and creationists.
Yes.
Where they use the same backwards methodology where they start with an answer and then they cherry pick evidence to rationalize that answer. That's something you just don't see into the scientific method. When somebody disagrees, people want to see your facts. They don't immediately want to shout you down. Like if somebody comes out and says, no, I actually have the evidence. I say, well, what's your experiment? Have you gotten a paper published in a peer-reviewed journal? And another similarity between the 9/11 conspiracy theorists and the creationists is their way of getting around that is to create their own bogus
peer-reviewed journal. Yeah.
It's peer-reviewed. It's like reviewed by other conspiracy theorists.
Yeah, so literally they're their own peers.
Yes.
Yeah, literally.
What does it take to get what does it take to get your paper rejected by one of those journals? Has a paper ever been rejected by one of those journals?
Well, I'm only aware of one, but the parallels that you make with regards to intelligent design and truthers is the similarities are actually very are amazing. First of all, instead of having their own science, they attack the science of the other. So, there's the gap in the fossil record, which would be the intelligent design.
The assumption of a false dichotomy, too, that simply all they need to prove their point is to disprove another one.
Exactly.
Where instead that would put you at sort of a neutral, I don't know.
Right. You have your own version of irreducible complexity. You have special pleading. These all the same tactics.
Appeal to ignorance, too. I don't know any other way this could have happened.
Therefore, it has to be this. You see a lot of the same tactics used by truthers in their arguments as was done by the intelligent design community. It's really, the parallels are actually fascinating. So anyway, let's go ahead and take a look at slide number 5. And basically what we're going to do is we're going to look at how the World Trade Center was designed in terms of its column placement. Slide number 5, pull that up for me. So basically here's a cutaway top section view of the World Trade Center towers. We have 47 center core columns. We have perimeter columns around the edges. And here's what the design of the World Trade Center Tower, how it was different from buildings of its time, is that core columns are generally distributed evenly throughout the entire floor. But what they did differently with this was to put them all in the center. And what that did, the benefit of that was that it allowed for tenants to be able to put in different kinds of furniture and different wall placements. And it gave tenants more freedom to be able to place their office workers. The downside to this was that it made it uniquely vulnerable to a plane hitting it. What you have is you have a wide gap. You have the plane punches through a perimeter column. It has this wide field to go through, and then all the core columns are placed together. It's kind of like the reason why in a platoon everybody spreads apart, because if a grenade hits, you'll all be affected by it. So the core columns, they're all together. Pull that graphic up again for me, please. The core columns are all together, and
when something punches through there,
they're all affected.
There's an immediate resistance from the outside columns, but then nothing to slow it down as it hits all of them at once.
Right. So that's, and I will say that there are buildings now that are designed the same way, that took lessons from World Trade Center Tower, and they built their offices the same way with a core column in the middle and a wide area for office workers to work around it. So before you panic, they've learned how to fix the redundancy in these buildings so that if a plane did hit them, that the building would survive.
And so, the World Trade Center buildings, those were built in the 1960s?
It was designed in the 1960s. I think it was started in the late 60s and finished in 1974.
Okay, so potentially it was a pretty controversial decision to have it built in this way. Basically, they were choosing function or form over function, the ability to adapt the office space to the tenant's degree over the potential safety issues.
Right. The building is made of lighter materials than typically. Basically, each floor was put on a truss instead of a girder. And a truss is a lighter way of making a floor. And we have a graphic for it, but I don't think we'll be able to go that far back on it. Let's go ahead and jump over to slide number 6, because I wanted to show a cutaway of the towers from a side view. And basically what it does is it shows the way it'll show the elevator placement as it was done in the World Trade Center towers. If you look to the right there, you see that basically we're looking at the elevators here, and you'll see that not all elevators went to the top. They went to what's known as a sky lobby. You'll have, if you worked on the top floor, you would take an elevator from the bottom, or you'd take an express elevator to a sky lobby. You would do it again to another sky lobby, and then finally to your floor. And that's basically how it worked. That's the only way they could fit all those elevators into a building that tall. So a lot of times truthers will say, well, you know what, there were squibs. As the building came down, there were all these squibs that exploded out, and that's evidence of the fact that there were bombs placed in the building. But what they don't say is that although not all the squibs happened on a sky lobby floor, every floor that was a sky lobby had a squib. And what that suggests...
You're talking about an outward explosion.
Yes, yeah. And a squib is a term used by movie makers when they have an explosion. It's just a puff of air and dust and things like that. I'm so in the vernacular, I sometimes forget to.
Yeah, I mean that's what the sky lobby is. It's largely a large pocket of air rather than having office buildings and having it partitioned off. Be one large area.
Right. So as the building came down and as the floors collapsed, you have this perfect tunnel that can push all the air out of a sky lobby. So anyway, that's just a point I wanted to mention. So let's go ahead to slide number 8, and I think that this best illustrates the shape of the World Trade Center towers. And that was, it was considered what's known as a tube within tube design. We have the core columns in the middle, and we have the perimeter columns on the edge, and that's what held the building up in a nutshell. That's going to be a slide that's going to be very important when it comes to when we look at the topple over scenario and why it was impossible for this building to topple over. Okay. So let's go on to slide number 9. And that is the first assertion made by truthers, and that is that the World Trade Center towers was designed to handle a 707. And to make this assertion, they quote Leslie Robertson, who was the chief structural engineer of this building, and he says the following. And he does say the following. He says, "The World Trade Center towers were designed to handle the impact of a Boeing 707, but in true truther style, they cut out the rest." That's very important stuff.
Oh, this is sort of like when people quote mine the Darwin thing about the eye.
Right. Right. In that case, Darwin was being honest about not knowing something, and then he goes on to, well, he's honest about irreducible complexity in the eye, and he goes on to break that apart.
Yeah, the connection between 2 paragraphs is essentially but.
Yes.
And then it's saying, well, it seems like it would be impossible for blank to happen, but it did.
Right, and they'll cut out the but part. So anyway, let's take a look at what Leslie Robertson said. He said they had designed the building for the largest impact plane of its time. But the difference is that this plane was flying a lot faster than what they accounted for. The 707 that they had planned for the 1960s, they were thinking that it was going to be flying through fog, trying to land, and maybe made a mistake and hit the buildings at about 180 miles an hour. They were not planning on a fully loaded jet with 10,000 gallons of fuel hitting at 490 miles an hour.
Something else to take into account, they weren't talking about somebody intentionally hitting the building, too.
Right.
They were saying, you're talking about fog, somebody would eventually see the building and try to steer away from it. And then it might graze it, it might hit it. But they weren't talking about somebody intentionally aiming for the building in clear skies and trying to actually maximize impact. I mean, there's one of the impacts, you actually see the plane rotate to the side so that it can hit as much of the building as possible.
Right.
So that's an even greater impact than they accounted for. I don't think they thought anyone was going to intentionally try to take the building down.
Because what pilot would be flying at 1,000 feet at 490 miles an hour? No one would be doing it. It's just one of those things you just can't account for they didn't account for when they designed the building. The other thing that Leslie Robertson mentions is that the fuel load. In the 1960s, liquid modeling isn't what we know it is today. I mean, we have computers that can crunch the numbers, and we have a pretty good idea of when explosive fuels hit a building, how they'll impact a building and what will happen, where we'll go. 1960s, they didn't have anything like that kind of technology that we enjoy today. So, in hindsight, we could say, oh, how can we even plan for something like that? But you really have to think of their time, and they just didn't have that technology that we enjoy. So slide number 9B, basically I want to give people a sense of the scope of how large the plane was in terms of the size of the building. And so in this slide, we're looking at a top-down view, and the 767, which is the last slide, the bottom slide in that deck, that gives you a sense as to how large this plane was in relation to the building that it hit.
And the blue square, that represents the actual center columns?
Blue square in the middle.
Of the jet, where it shows that.
The blue square that's a floor plan of a typical high-rise.
Oh, high rise.
Yeah. This was a graphic done by FEMA, so I actually wouldn't have put that in there. It doesn't make any sense. But the larger square that plane is in, that's the floor plan of the World Trade Center towers.
But I have to assume, based on the picture you showed earlier, that if it doesn't hit all of the support columns, it certainly hits a majority of them crashing through that.
Right.
Even if it hit a side and didn't hit direct center, you're still going to hit a majority of those support columns. I mean, that seems like the perfect attack if you wanted to take this thing down.
Yeah, exactly right. And so this building type was uniquely vulnerable to this kind of attack. And that's something no one could have accounted for. No one knew that. So we talked a little bit about speed. They thought that the plane would hit the building at about 180 miles an hour. Well, the way it works is that an object's speed, the amount of energy it gives off, is inversely proportional by its square to how fast it's going. So if it's twice as fast, it's 4 times as much energy. If it's 3 times as fast, it's 9 times as much energy. So here we're talking about almost 3 times as much energy, probably 4 times as much energy hitting the building that they could have accounted for. So the fact that the building's actually held up is a real testament to the fact that engineering wasn't so bad. So let's go to the next point. We've kind of beat that one down. Let's go to the next point that 9/11 truthers have made, and we're going to go to slide deck 10A, and that is the hallmarks of controlled demolition. All right. So why controlled demolition? Why do you think? I want to ask a truther, why do you think there was controlled demolition? I mean, that's so obvious. Why not just tip the building over?
Yeah, I mean, the one question I have is tipping the building over would actually be far more, if the goal, and it seems to be the consensus that truthers have, is that this was a staged attack to create fear to accomplish a political goal. And it seems like the building tipping over would be far more effective at that. And it seems like even before, I watched some of the news footage of this again yesterday, and it had actually been a couple years. It really seems like the smoking hole was terrifying enough. People were terrified. I remember when I had actually slept through what was the initial attack. I mean, we're on the West Coast.
Yeah.
But when I first turned on the TV, it was just a smoking hole, and that was terrifying. It seems like you wouldn't actually need to bring the building down. And there's another question. What had happened if one of the planes had missed? What if only one of the buildings had been brought down? Certainly there'd be an investigation of all the nearby buildings, to make sure that it's safe, that people can go back inside of it. They would have found those charges. And it seems like at that point, your entire story falls apart. And why these conspiracy theorists tend to create this sort of straw man villain who's both simultaneously brilliant and a moron at the same time.
Right.
Where any one thing could have made this whole plan fall apart.
Right. It's kind of this family circus style of terrorism. Instead of just a straight line, you're going over the fence and behind the yard, and you're circling through the pool, and you're going through some neighbor's backyard, and you're getting some candy, and it doesn't make any sense.
Yeah.
Why would it? All right. So let's talk about why do you have controlled demolitions? You have controlled demolitions so you don't affect the buildings around the building you want to destroy. That's why you have controlled demolitions. And truthers assert that that's why they did it as well, is that instead of just destroying it in some really dramatic fashion of tipping the building over, that they didn't want to destroy buildings around it. So
it seems like that's counterintuitive to what they want.
Right. That for some reason, maybe the Port Authority decided, no, we don't want to destroy all the buildings in the area.
It seems like there were, I've heard estimates of something like 50,000 workers in that building before it was evacuated. It seems like bringing it down even further would create even more fear. So it doesn't make sense that they'd want to make this building collapse safe.
Right.